Picture this. Sarah Matthews stands in the doorway of her modest single-story home, arms crossed as she faces down the property manager of Golden Pines Community. Behind her, a Marine veteran named James sits on her couch, his service dog Luna, curled protectively at his feet. The manager, Linda Harrington, waves a violation notice in the air. "This is the final warning, Ms. Matthews. No unauthorized pets allowed." "It's clearly stated in the HOA bylaws you signed," Linda says, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who enjoys enforcing rules. Sarah doesn't budge. Luna is not a pet. She's a certified service animal for a decorated Marine veteran. "The Fair Housing Act protects—" "I don't care what act you think applies," Linda interrupts, her eyes narrowing. "The board has made its decision. Either the dog goes, or you do." James struggles to his feet, his prosthetic leg catching on the coffee table. Luna immediately rises, steadying him with her body. "Ma'am, please." Luna helps me with my PTSD. She's trained to— "Not my problem," Linda cuts him off. "Rules are rules. You have 30 days to comply, Ms. Matthews." As Linda walks away, she turns with a smirk. "You really should have thought twice before becoming a bleeding heart for strays. Both the 4-legged and 2-legged kind." Sarah watches her leave, a cold feeling of dread spreading through her chest. She's worked too hard for this home, to lose it now. But little did she know, her stand against injustice wouldn't go unnoticed, and the quiet suburban power struggle she just initiated was about to change the entire community forever. Let me take you back to where it all began. Sarah Matthews had moved to Golden Pines Community 3 years ago after saving every penny from her job as a physical therapist at the local VA hospital. At 35, she'd finally achieved her dream of home ownership, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a small backyard where she could garden on weekends. Her colleagues admired her patience with the most difficult cases, her ability to coax progress from veterans who had given up hope of recovery. On weekends, she volunteered at the rehabilitation center, offering free physical therapy sessions for veterans who couldn't afford ongoing care. That's where she met James Wilson, a 28-year-old former Marine who had lost his right leg below the knee in Afghanistan. More debilitating than his physical injury was the PTSD that kept him housebound most days, jumping at sudden noises and struggling through panic attacks that left him gasping for air. "The nightmares are the worst," he told Sarah during their 3rd session together. "I can handle the pain in my leg. I can't handle the screaming in my head." Sarah had suggested a service dog program, helping James navigate the application process and training requirements. 6 months later, Luna came into his life, a steady, intuitive German shepherd with warm brown eyes and training that allowed her to sense James's anxiety attacks before they fully manifested. The transformation was remarkable. James began venturing outside again, Luna always by his side, alerting him to his rising stress levels and providing deep pressure therapy when needed. He could go to grocery stores, attend therapy appointments, even consider looking for work again. On a particularly beautiful spring day, Sarah invited James to her home for coffee on her patio, wanting to show him how well his mobility had improved. As they sat enjoying the sunshine, Sarah noticed Linda Harrington peering over the fence from the sidewalk, her gaze fixed on Luna with obvious disapproval. Sarah had seen that look before. Linda, the self-appointed enforcer of every minor HOA rule, had been elected property manager the previous year. She carried the HOA rule book like a weapon, issuing violation notices for grass half an inch too tall or trash cans left at the curb 5 minutes past collection time. "Lovely dog," Linda called out, her tone suggesting the opposite. "I wasn't aware you had a pet, Ms. Matthews." Sarah rose from her chair and approached the fence. "She's not my pet. This is Luna, a service dog for my friend James. He's a Marine veteran." Linda's eyes narrowed slightly as they slid from Luna to James, taking in his prosthetic leg. "I see. Well, there are proper channels for pet approval in this community. I'm sure you're aware. Service animals aren't classified as pets under federal law," Sarah explained politely. "The Fair Housing Act is quite clear about reasonable accommodations." Linda's lips thinned to a tight line. "We'll see about that. Golden Pines has very specific policies." She walked away, her phone already at her ear. James looked uncomfortable. "Maybe I shouldn't come here anymore. I don't want to cause you trouble." Sarah shook her head firmly. You and Luna are always welcome in my home. Linda just likes to throw her weight around. Don't worry about it. But as she watched Linda's retreating figure, Sarah couldn't help feeling that the conversation had been more than a casual observation. It felt like a warning. 3 days later, Sarah returned home from work to find a violation notice taped to her front door. Unauthorized pet on premises, it read. First warning. Sarah immediately called the HOA office and explained the situation to the administrative assistant. This is a misunderstanding. The dog that was here was a service animal for a visiting veteran, not my pet. I'll make a note in your file, the assistant said helpfully. But you should probably speak directly with Ms. Harrington. She's very particular about documentation. The next day, Sarah spotted Linda in the community garden and approached her with a printed copy of the Fair Housing Act guidelines regarding service animals. I wanted to clear up the misunderstanding about Luna, Sarah began. She's a certified service dog for a combat veteran. Here's the relevant information about. Linda barely glanced at the papers. Our community has a strict no pets policy for good reason. Allergies, noise, damage to common areas. If everyone claimed their animal was special, we'd be overrun. This isn't about claiming anything, Sarah replied, keeping her voice level. Service animals are protected by federal law. They're not pets. They're medical necessities. Linda's expression hardened. Submit a formal accommodation request to the board if you must. Until then, any dog on your property is a violation. She turned and walked away, calling over her shoulder. 3 violations and you'll be facing fines. 5 and we begin eviction proceedings. Sarah stood there, papers still in hand, a mixture of disbelief and anger rising in her chest. She'd always followed the rules, always been a good neighbor. How had this become a battle? That evening, she called James to explain the situation. Maybe we should meet at the park instead, just until I can get this sorted out. I'm sorry, Sarah, James said, his voice heavy with familiar guilt. Luna and I are always causing problems. This isn't your fault, Sarah insisted. Linda's on some kind of power trip. I'll handle it. But the following week brought a second violation notice when James had stopped by briefly to drop off a thank you gift. A potted plant for Sarah's garden. Linda had apparently been watching from her car parked across the street and immediately documented Luna's presence. This is ridiculous, Sarah muttered, crumpling the notice. She immediately drafted a formal reasonable accommodation request, attaching Luna's service dog certification, a letter from James's doctor explaining the medical necessity, and highlighted sections of the Fair Housing Act. She also reached out to Marcus Johnson, a lawyer who lived 3 doors down and had always been friendly during community events. Over coffee at his kitchen table, Marcus reviewed her documentation. You're absolutely right about the law, he confirmed. Service animals are a protected accommodation. The HOA can't legally prevent your friend from visiting with his service dog. So what's Linda's game here? Sarah asked. Marcus sighed. Between you and me, Linda has been using technical violations to force out homeowners she doesn't want in the community. Last month, the Singh family moved rather than fight her over their religious holiday decorations. Before that, the elderly Gonzalez couple left after constant harassment about their grandson's visits. That's horrible, Sarah said. Why doesn't anyone stop her? Most people don't have the energy for the fight, Marcus explained. And Linda has 3 loyal board members who vote with her on everything. But this service dog issue? This is where she's legally vulnerable. If you're willing to stand your ground, I'll help you. The next HOA meeting became the battlefield. Sarah presented her case clearly, citing the relevant laws and explaining James's need for Luna. Several neighbors nodded in understanding, but Linda had come prepared. While I sympathize with veterans, she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. The accommodation request is for a non-resident to bring an animal into our pet-free community repeatedly. This poses ongoing exposure risks to residents with allergies and creates a precedent that could undermine our community standards. The law doesn't distinguish between resident and visitor accommodations when it comes to service animals, Sarah countered. Linda's smile didn't reach her eyes. Our legal counsel disagrees. Your request is denied. Sarah looked around the room, noticing how many neighbors avoided her gaze. Only Marcus and a few others met her eyes with sympathy. As they left the Meeting. An older woman named Dorothy touched Sarah's arm. "My husband was in Vietnam," she whispered. "He would have benefited from a service dog if they'd had them back then. Don't give up." The encounter gave Sarah strength, but Linda's campaign was just beginning. The third violation came when James had a severe panic attack at the VA and Sarah brought him to her home to recover, knowing the sterile hospital environment was making things worse. Linda appeared within 30 minutes, violation notice in hand, taking photos of Luna through Sarah's window. Sarah had had enough. She began documenting everything, taking photos when Linda peered into her windows, saving emails, recording conversations when legal. She installed a doorbell camera and security cameras around her property, capturing Linda's increasingly frequent drive-bys. Marcus helped her file a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, alleging harassment and discrimination against a disabled veteran. They gathered statements from neighbors who had witnessed Linda's behavior. What they discovered was more disturbing than they'd imagined. Dorothy introduced them to 5 former residents who had left after similar harassment campaigns. 2 had been families with autistic children whom Linda had cited for noise violations. Another was a black family who had been written up for unauthorized gatherings when they hosted family barbecues. "She's been systematically pushing out anyone who doesn't fit her vision of the right kind of resident," Marcus concluded after reviewing the patterns. The evidence mounting, Sarah decided to bring James to the next community potluck, Luna by his side. She had informed several sympathetic neighbors, including Dorothy and Marcus, who positioned themselves nearby for support. As expected, Linda immediately approached. "You need to remove that animal from the premises immediately," she demanded loudly enough for nearby conversations to halt. "Luna is a service dog, assisting a disabled veteran," Sarah replied calmly. "She's protected under federal law." "This is private property governed by our HOA agreements," Linda snapped. James, normally conflict avoidant, stood straighter. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I served this country so people could live freely in their homes without harassment. Playing the veteran card won't work here," Linda hissed, her mask of propriety slipping. "We have standards in this community. People like you—" "People like what exactly?" Marcus interrupted, stepping forward with his phone visibly recording. Linda's face flushed. "People who think the rules don't apply to them." Dorothy joined them, her voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "My Walter died defending this country. He would be ashamed to see how you're treating this young man and his service dog." Other neighbors began to whisper, some moving closer to Sarah and James in silent support. Linda, realizing she had miscalculated the public confrontation, retreated with a terse, "This isn't over." But the community had witnessed her true colors. That night, Sarah received an email from the HOA board. The subject line read, "Final. Warning before legal action." The message stated that due to repeated and willful violations of community standards, they were initiating eviction proceedings. She had 30 days to remedy all violations or face legal action and forced sale of her property. Sarah's hands shook as she forwarded the email to Marcus. This was her home. She had worked so hard for it, and now she might lose everything because she stood up for what was right. "They can't do this," she whispered to herself, but the fear crept in nonetheless. Could she afford a protracted legal battle? Would the federal complaint be resolved in time? James called the next morning, having heard about the escalation from Marcus. "Sarah, I can't let you lose your house over this. Luna and I won't visit anymore. Maybe they'll back off." "That's exactly what they want," Sarah replied, though her voice wavered. "For people to be so afraid they give up their rights. I can't let them win." But as the days passed and Linda's car continued to patrol her street, as neighbors began to avoid her at the mailbox, Sarah felt the weight of her stand growing heavier. She had already spent thousands on legal consultations beyond what Marcus could provide pro bono. Then came the most outrageous violation yet. Sarah returned home from a long shift at the VA to find her front door ajar. Heart pounding, she called the police before carefully entering. Nothing seemed to be missing, but her papers regarding the HOA dispute had been rifled through, and a new violation notice sat prominently on her kitchen counter, inside her locked home. The responding officer took her statement, but seemed skeptical. "No signs of forced entry, ma'am. Are you sure you didn't leave the door unlocked? I'm positive, Sarah insisted, the violation of her private space leaving her shaken. After the police left, she called Marcus. They were in my house, Marcus. In my house. That crosses every line, he said grimly. We need to accelerate the HUD complaint and add breaking and entering charges. But the next morning brought the final blow. Sarah received a certified letter from the Golden Pines HOA legal counsel. They were exercising their right to force the sale of her property based on irreparable and ongoing violations of community standards. The paperwork had already been filed with the court. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the letter blurring through her tears. Everything she had worked for, gone because she refused to turn away a veteran and his service dog. The injustice of it burned, but the practical reality was crushing. She couldn't fight this alone. With shaking hands, she called James to tell him what had happened. "This is my fault," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No," Sarah replied firmly. "This is Linda's fault, and a system that lets someone like her abuse power." There was a long pause before James spoke again. "I know someone who might be able to help. My former commanding officer. He works with veteran advocacy groups now." "James, I appreciate that, but let me make a call," he insisted. "Colonel Matthews takes this kind of discrimination personally." Sarah agreed, though she held little hope. What could one more person do against the legal machinery already in motion? The next day dawned with Sarah packing boxes, the reality of her situation sinking in. The doorbell rang around noon. Expecting another legal notice, she was surprised to find James standing there with a tall, imposing man in a crisp marine dress, uniform adorned with ribbons and medals. "Sarah, this is Colonel Robert Matthews, my former commanding officer," James said, a hint of pride in his voice. The colonel extended his hand. "Ms. Matthews, I understand you've been fighting a battle on behalf of one of my Marines." Sarah shook his hand, noticing the folder tucked under his arm emblazoned with the seal of the Judge Advocate General's office. "I'm not sure how much you can do, Colonel. They've already filed for forced sale." His expression remained impassive. "Ma'am, Marines don't abandon their own, and they certainly don't abandon those who look after our own. May I come in?" Over the next hour, Sarah detailed everything that had happened, showing him her documentation, the violation notices, the security footage, and the final letter. The colonel took meticulous notes, occasionally asking for clarification. When she finished, he closed his notebook with purpose. "What you're describing is a clear violation of federal housing law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and possibly criminal trespass and harassment. More importantly, it's an affront to the sacrifice of every service member who fought for the rights you're being denied." He stood, straightening his already impeccable uniform. "The JAG office has taken an interest in several similar cases, nationally. Discrimination against veterans with service animals has become a troubling pattern. Your case will now be part of our advocacy initiative." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "What happens now?" "Now," the colonel said with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to command, "we bring in reinforcements." What unfolded over the next 24 hours would be forever etched in the community's collective memory. The colonel made a series of calls from Sarah's living room, his voice never raising, but carrying undeniable authority. By evening, a legal team from the Veterans Justice Outreach Program had arrived, along with representatives from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division and a specialist from the Fair Housing Enforcement Office. News vans gathered at the community entrance the following morning as word spread about the federal intervention in what was quickly being framed as discrimination against a decorated Marine veteran. Social media exploded with the story, veteran, groups across the country sharing James's story and Sarah's stand. The HOA emergency meeting that night was standing room only. Linda arrived to find the small community center packed with residents, media representatives, and an impressive array of military and government officials. Colonel Matthews stood at attention near the board table, Luna sitting calmly at his feet, James at his side. Sarah noticed Linda's face pale at the sight. The meeting opened with Linda attempting to maintain control. "This emergency session will address the ongoing violations by homeowner Sarah Matthews and the unwarranted outside interference in our community governance." The colonel stepped forward. Before these proceedings continue, I have documents to present to the board. He placed a thick folder before each board member. This contains evidence of systematic discrimination against protected classes within your community, including disabled veterans, families with special needs children, and minority homeowners. It also contains notification of federal investigation into these practices under the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and civil rights statutes. Linda attempted to interrupt, but the colonel continued with unwavering composure. Additionally, you'll find a cease and desist order regarding the forced sale of Ms. Matthews' property, along with affidavits from 15 former residents detailing similar discriminatory practices that forced them from their homes. The room had fallen completely silent. Finally, there is notification that the Department of Justice is reviewing evidence of possible criminal misconduct, including unauthorized entry into Ms. Matthews' home, falsification of HOA records, and misappropriation of HOA funds for personal use. At this, a murmur swept through the crowd. Linda's face had gone from pale to ashen. "What funds?" one board member asked, turning to Linda with suspicion. The colonel nodded to a woman in a dark suit who stepped forward. "I'm Special Agent Reyes with the FBI. We have documentation showing approximately $247,000 in community funds diverted to private accounts over the past 3 years, coinciding with Ms. Harrington's tenure as property manager." The meeting dissolved into chaos as board members began distancing themselves from Linda. Residents shouted questions, and reporters scribbled notes furiously. Through it all, Colonel Matthews stood unmoving beside Sarah and James, a bulwark against the storm he had unleashed. By midnight, the board had voted unanimously to rescind all actions against Sarah, to formally acknowledge service animals as protected accommodations within the community, and to place Linda on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. 3 board members had resigned, citing personal reasons. As people filed out of the community center, neighbors who had avoided Sarah for weeks now approached to offer support and apologies. Dorothy hugged her tightly, whispering, "Walter would have been proud of you, dear." The colonel shook Sarah's hand formally before departing. "The JAG office will remain involved until this is fully resolved. You did the right thing standing your ground, Ms. Matthews." James, who had remained quiet throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. "I told you he was the right person to call." Sarah smiled through tears of relief. "I guess Marines really don't leave anyone behind." "Never," James affirmed, as Luna pressed reassuringly against his leg. In the weeks that followed, the community underwent a transformation. The investigation into Linda's activities revealed not only financial improprieties, but a systematic campaign to reshape the neighborhood according to her preferences, targeting residents who didn't fit her vision with manufactured violations and harassment. The legal consequences were swift and comprehensive. Linda faced criminal charges for embezzlement and breaking and entering. The HOA insurance policy covered the misappropriated funds, and a court-appointed administrator took over community management temporarily. More importantly, a community healing began. A new board was elected, with Dorothy as president and Marcus as legal advisor. Their first official act was to establish clear anti-discrimination policies and a transparent grievance process. James, with Sarah's encouragement, became an advocate for veteran housing rights, speaking at community forums across the state. His story, and Sarah's stand, became a rallying point for service dog awareness campaigns nationally. For Sarah, the most meaningful change was the sense of true community that emerged from the crisis. Neighbors now greeted James and Luna warmly when they visited. Children asked permission to pet Luna when she was off duty, learning about the important work of service animals. 1 year later, on a perfect spring day much like the one when the trouble began, Sarah hosted a community barbecue in her backyard. James was there with Luna, now joined by 3 other veterans with service dogs who had recently moved into Golden Pines. Dorothy brought her famous potato salad and an announcement. The community had unanimously voted to convert the unused lot near the entrance into a service dog training park, named in honor of her late husband. As Sarah looked around at her neighbors laughing and sharing stories, at James confidently explaining Luna's training to interested children, she reflected on how close she had come to losing it all. On her garden fence hung a small plaque James had given her. bearing the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. It had become her reminder that standing up for what's right, even when it costs you, is always the path to follow. The irony, Marcus said, joining her with a glass of lemonade, is that Linda wanted to force out people who made the community undesirable. Instead, she brought us all together and made this place what it always should have been. Sarah nodded, watching as Luna gently guided a child's hand to show proper petting technique. Sometimes it takes a fight to find out what's worth fighting for. Later that evening, as the gathering wound down, a young couple approached Sarah. The woman was pregnant, and the man walked with a slight limp, a service dog, a calm Labrador, at his side. "We're moving in next week," the man explained. "We heard this community was especially welcoming to veterans with service animals." Sarah smiled, feeling the full circle of the moment. "Welcome home," she said, and meant it with all her heart. "If you've ever stood your ground against injustice, whether for yourself or someone else, we want to hear your story." The ripple effects of standing up for what's right can change entire communities, just as Sarah's courage transformed Golden Pines. Have you witnessed discrimination against service animals or veterans? Has someone ever stood up for you when you needed it most? Share your experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of everyday courage and extraordinary comebacks. Remember, sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant battlefields, but right in our own communities.